Good morning, everyone. Good morning. What a joy it is to see all of you this morning, and some of you are so dear and precious to me and to the Fruitvale congregation, and we have had a great association throughout the years, and what a blessing it is to be here, to be with you this morning. My particular subject matter this morning will be peace in the midst of turmoil. And so we'll delve into that in just a few moments. And I just want to say how thankful I am for the workshop. Make me a servant. But as we look out, and as I look out, you've all understand the principle. As we imitate Jesus, strive to imitate Him, then we also understand that it's through service that we attain what? Greatness. You remember when Jesus was talking to His disciples and He says, if you want to be great, be a servant. Now that is so contrary to the society in which we live, wherein everyone seems to be ready, willing, and able to step on top of any and everyone to get to where they think they want to be or need to be. Servanthood is the means to greatness. So this Make Me a Servant workshop is in essence addressed to all of us to make us better servants. Let me be fuller in my service and my devotion to God. And so this morning, as we turn our attention to peace in the midst of turmoil, and I did not know, but I knew, coming over this morning, we would sing, Master, the Tempest is Raging. Because of the theme that our lectureship is based around, peace, be still. Comes to us from Mark chapter 4, 35 through 41. So if you do not have that open yet, please do so. Turn to Mark chapter 4, 35 through 41, as we will deal with peace in the midst of turmoil based out of, or at least by looking at part of this section this morning. And so as we think about peace, be still, conjure in your mind, think in your mind, if you will, of how powerful, meaningful, desirable those words are. How many people want peace? They want peace. And if not knowing where to find it or how to achieve it, they turn to what? A myriad of other vices that will dull their senses, that will medicate them in some way so that they arrive at what? Peace. But when the medication, the vice, the chosen means of attaining peace wears off, what happens? The turmoil begins to rage again and again and again. I preached a lady's funeral about 25 years ago. An erring member of the church. She had a wonderful history of her family and being members of the church. But for some reason, this was the mindset she possessed. Things should never be this good. And that tormented her all of her adult life until she killed herself in a drunken automobile accident. Her whole life was revolving around turmoil. And she told me, she said, Carl, I know when I do things that are right and good and that please Jesus, peace comes into my life. And she said, I began to feel guilty. Things should not be this good. And I would say that from the very outset, that's an odd way to look at life. Everything is going good, everything is peaceful, everything is harmonious, and that brings up and brought up in her mind guilt. And I wonder, is she the only person, Christian or non-Christian, who feels guilt because life is going so good? Peace in the midst of turmoil. Peace, be still. Powerful, powerful words. And when we talk about peace, the biblical definition of peace is not the absence of conflict, it's not the absence of difficulties, but what it's identifying is how you and I respond to that circumstance. Now, there are three things in this world I know I cannot control. I cannot control people. I can't. I cannot control circumstances. Oftentimes, circumstances are what? Beyond our control. And thirdly, I cannot control the events of life. If I could, we wouldn't have had an ice storm. I don't have that power. I don't have that ability. Now, if I'm thinking about peace, then I realize that peace is something that really identifies me inwardly and how I respond to these people, circumstances, and events. Now, the Bible gives me a lot of information as to how I am to respond. But I think a very interesting phrase is found in Luke chapter 9 and verse 50. Luke 9:50. At the end of that 50th verse, Jesus says, have salt in you. And have what? Peace within yourselves. Now, the immediate context of that, we would have the disciples as they were arguing and discussing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom, who's going to be in that chief place. And Jesus is addressing that in the verses immediately preceding this. But then when he comes to the end of this context, he says, now, have salt in yourself. What does that mean? We are the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. So we are the salt of the earth and we are the light of the world. But what does it mean to have salt in you? What does salt do? Now, it does flavor our food, and we're grateful for that. Watermelon and salt, two things that just go together. Watermelon and salt. Lena's shaking her head, and she's like, oh, I can't believe you said that. But she'll grow out of that. Salt is good, though, in the fact that it flavors our food. But more importantly, salt was intended to be what? A preservative. They would put it on it to preserve their food. And I understand from reading some things briefly about salt that if it was preserved correctly and with salt, that it could be preserved indefinitely. Not for just a brief period of time, but for years and years and years to come. So salt has that preserving influence. So now you think about us as Christians and have salt in you. That tells me I'm to be doing what? Preserving. I'm to be preserving what? I'm to have a preserving influence whether it comes to the truth of the gospel, it comes to my relationship with people, it comes to the circumstances that I find myself, the events of life, it comes to the morality of this country, it comes to so many things. A Christian is to have a preserving what? Influence. And I'm to have a preserving influence even in the midst of what? Turmoil. I have that preserving influence, and then out of that, now what else exists? Peace. Peace within yourselves. Peace among yourselves. So as we think about our subject this morning, it is going to be addressed throughout the day. And when the day is done, we will not have exhausted everything the Bible has to say about what? Peace. So as we think about peace, we want it nationally. We want peace nationally for our country. There is to be peace that exists between individuals, that is to be harmonious. We want the security and the safety and the prosperity that comes from peace. We want, more importantly, above all of these, and I think they're a byproduct of this one thing, we want the peace that only Jesus can provide. You've seen the little statement, N-O, no peace, no Jesus. And then you put the K and the W added onto the word no. And so without Jesus, we're without peace. But if I know K-N-O-W, Jesus, I ought to what? Know peace. I ought to know that. And so this morning as we begin and as we go through the day, I hope we'll be reminded of the fact that Jesus is the source of peace. And so what is the definition of turmoil? Turmoil. Just according to the Oxford language via Google, it's a state of great disturbance. A state of confusion or uncertainty. And as I stated earlier, I'm oftentimes confused by people, circumstances, and events. So as we talk about peace in the midst of turmoil, learning and knowing what we might know about peace is not going to remove us from what? Turmoil. Jesus clearly just spelled that for us in John 16 and verse 33. In this world you will have tribulation. We're going to have those problems. We're going to have those difficulties. And so now how am I going to respond to these particular circumstances, certain people, certain events? You remember long ago in the book of Genesis, chapter 4 and verse number 9, this question is asked, am I my brother's keeper? What's the answer to that? That implies I'm going to have to learn how to deal with whom? People. What about Romans 12, verse 18? And if it is possible, as much as it lies within you, or as much as it depends upon you, be at peace with all men. We'll delve into that a little bit later on, and it will be brought up again by one lesson, one of our speakers, but it is certainly something that we need to consider as much as it lies with you, or as much as it is possible, and as much as it depends upon you, you be at peace with all men. And what about Hebrews 12:14? Pursue peace with all men. Now, who does all include? Folks, I cannot be peaceable with my brothers and sisters in Christ and then go out and be unpeaceable with those who are non-Christians. I need to be showing them the peace of Christ, which rules in our hearts and rules in our what? In our minds. And I must be demonstrating that to those who have never heard of Jesus. Because if they've never heard of Jesus and they have not obeyed Jesus and they don't know Jesus in the true biblical sense, I can assure you they have no what in their life? They have no peace. And so I am to be one who is pursuing peace with all men and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. How important is pursuing peace? My eternal destiny rests upon it. Now, does my eternal destiny, does it rest upon the fact that I've obeyed the gospel? Does it rest upon the fact that I must be worshiping God in spirit and truth? We could go through and we could dot all the I's and cross all these T's, and yet peace must come into that equation. There must be peace. And my soul's destiny depends upon it. So now, having asked you to turn to Mark chapter 4, let's go there now. Mark chapter 4, 35 through 41. And I know you're familiar with this particular context, but it is that which is the theme for our workshop this weekend. And so let's read it together, Mark 4, 35 through 41, and then we'll come back and we'll make some comments on it. And then I want us to zero in on something and ask ourselves some questions based upon this particular context. Now notice Mark 4, 35. And the same day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that it was already filling. And he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "What kind of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now, as we turn our attention to this context, notice the events as they unfolded for the disciples. First of all, as we've very familiar, this had followed an extremely successful day. Now, I want to ask you a question. Are we much like Job's friends? Turmoil and problems come into people's lives because they're what? Sinners. Job, why were you going through all of this? Why did you lose your wife? Or your children? Why did you lose your animals? Why did you lose all those possessions? And Job, why did your wife tell you, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? Job, all of this came upon you because you're what? A sinner. I think oftentimes we can get deceived into thinking that problems are not going to come my way as long as I'm making sure I'm what? Striving to please God. Folks, the reality is problems may come into our life because we are striving to please God. They might be the reason for them. But notice they'd had a very successful day. And Jesus now says, let's get into the boat and cross over to the other side. So they get in and they're traveling, and suddenly a great storm comes up upon the ocean or upon the sea, and it is threatening their very lives. Now, if that was me in that boat, it wouldn't take much of a wave for me to get fearful. I'm not a sailor. I'm not one that has always loved being on the water. Now, I'm not terrified of the water. I used to love to water ski when I was younger. And I always wanted to slalom ski. You know, that's just something I wanted to do. So I wanted to be able to get up on one ski and just ski on one ski. And so one afternoon, my buddy and I, we decided, okay, we're going to go out and we're going to try and we're going to really work. And we're going to focus on me skiing on one ski. We got out there and the water, there was not a ripple on it. It was like glass. And he said, if you don't learn today, you never will. The conditions were absolutely what? Perfect. So after a while, fall, get up, fall, get up, fall, get up. Then I got it. And the only ripple on the water came from the boat engine and the ski I was riding on. It was absolutely great. That's what Jesus caused to happen on that lake. It wasn't something that took a long period of time. Jesus said, peace, be still. And notice he rebuked the natural elements. And immediately calm was restored. They had had a fantastic day preaching and teaching. They'd had a fantastic trip across the water till a certain point, and then Jesus calmed their fears, but at the same time, he created fears. Because at the end of this context, they're standing back looking at Jesus, and they said, who is this man? I mentioned the sister, the erring sister, and she couldn't deal with life being peaceful and calm. And I think I misjudged her years ago. The calm and the peacefulness created what within her? A fear that she was unaccustomed to. She'd fight anybody in the building anytime. She was not afraid of physical confrontation. That wasn't her fear. She was not afraid of saying what needed to be said. She went to her beautician one day, and she was on the straight and narrow, doing things that are right. And so she's in the chair, and the man was doing her hair, and anyway, he's cutting her hair and tending to her. And anyway, she's sitting in the chair, and she's going on and on and on about the sinfulness of homosexuality. And then it dawns on her. He's homosexual. So she asked him, she says, you're a homosexual, aren't you? And he said, yes, I am. And she said, well, please don't make my hair fall out. She just knew he was going to retaliate. She wasn't fearful of speaking her mind. What was she afraid of? Peace. Calm. I don't know that I'll ever run into another person in my life like her. But her story and our relationship has helped me to what? Maybe better help them, that they might understand peace in the midst of turmoil, even when that turmoil is raging where? Inside. So Jesus is one who calms the sea and calms the wind, and it became calm immediately. And another little side point on this, if you do any reading from those who are familiar with that area, they will stress that and Jesus is dealing with this and calming the sea. He did something that is unnatural for that part of the world. Even when the storms would cease on the Sea of Galilee, oftentimes the waves would roll for hours and hours and hours. Now, certainly we can make that application to people. We may calm the immediate storm, but what happens to the waves? They roll in their lives for days and even years. Now go with me back to Mark 4, because I really had to do some self-evaluation here. Because I made the statement at the very first of this context that it was in a setting wherein they had had a successful day teaching. What's the first thing in this context beginning in Mark 4 that he addresses? In my Bible, it's the parable of the sower. And what the parable of the sower? What's the story of the parable of the sower? We all know that. A sower went out to sow, and he sowed seed. And the seed is what? The Word of God. So he's sowing, there's the spiritual analogy. He's sowing the Word of God. And what does it fall into? 4 different types of hearts. One of them is as hard as this podium right here. The seed's not going to what? Not going to penetrate, not going to do any good till there's a change of what? Heart. And then you get into the second type of heart, and that's the heart that's real shallow. There's no depth to it. So the seed springs up real quickly, but then what happens? It goes away. It can't sustain itself. Then you have the third type of soil. And that's the type of soil that is good. But what happens to the heart? It gets caught up in what? The cares of the world. And the cares do what? Choke out the word so that it's no longer productive. Can't be productive. Then the fourth type is that good and honest. That's the heart and soul we're looking for, right? Because the seed's going to fall there, it's going to germinate, it's going to do its good work, and it's going to produce a lot of fruit. Just summarizing the account. But folks, who do we generally apply that to? We generally apply that to those who are where? And I think we need to look more inward. Is it possible for me to have particularly that third type of soil where I allow what? The cares, the things of this world to choke out the word. Because what I did not address is when Jesus is in the boat with his disciples, he rebukes them for no faith. So in the midst of turmoil, what's going to have to sustain us? Our faith. So we look at the parable of the sower, make application not to those outside of the body of Christ, even though it does apply. But now let's do those mirror moments where I go and I look in the mirror and I say, okay, Carl McCann, how are you living up to the parable of the sower? And in particularly, how are you applying this in our context today to peace in the midst of turmoil? When your life is chaotic, when the events of life have thrown you the proverbial curveball, when people are not doing and being, and even when they are doing and being everything they ought to be, but suddenly they're gone. Does that create turmoil? You bet it does. Now, am I going to have that peace that passes all understanding in that moment? Once again, not to get on another lesson that's to be addressed. But am I going to possess that peace in that moment? Because it takes great faith in those moments to deal with the turmoil, the trials, and the difficulty of life that are just unexpected. So as we think about Jesus and his parable of the sower, let's make more personal application of it rather than external. And how about the parable of the mustard seed? As you look at verse number 30, and he says, "Now to what shall we liken the kingdom of God, or with what parable shall we picture it?" How are we going to look at it? It is like a mustard seed, which when it is sown on the ground is smaller than all the seeds on earth, but when it is sown, it grows up, becomes greater than all herbs, and shoots out large branches, so that the birds of the air may nest under its shade. The parable of the mustard seed. Oh, how we love to see a mustard seed faith grow into what? An oak tree faith. And oftentimes the only way to get through that is what? Through trials and difficulties. The disciples are standing in awe of Jesus, and I want us to consider as we continue to move on from Mark 4:35, and we continue to look not only at that particular event and what unfolds as we see the disciples as they are experiencing a great day, then a great storm comes up which tests their faith. Jesus rebukes them for their faith, and then the fear that they once had concerning the storm is now somewhat internalized as they're trying to figure out who Jesus is and what manner of man this is. And we try to understand what can be possible causes of turmoil. When we deal with people, whether they be in the church or out of the church, or even as we make application to ourselves, what are means that can cause turmoil? Number one is ignorance. Folks, I don't mean this in any facetious way at all. But we dare not underestimate the power of ignorance. I mean, it's humorous in some regards, but at the same time it's not. And all you got to do is read Acts 3 verse 17 to realize the power of ignorance. As Peter is speaking to the Jewish leaders in Acts chapter 3, he says, "I know they crucified Jesus because of ignorance." Ignorance. Now, they were envious. They were hateful of him. There were a lot of other things. But all of those things, their hate, their envy, all of those other things that are right there on the surface, they had one underlying cause: ignorance. If the Jewish leaders had understood the law of Moses and the fact that it was intended to bring us to whom? Christ. Would they have approached Jesus different? If they had understood all of the prophetic statements, would that have caused them to approach Jesus differently? But because they were ignorant, they crucified him. You can't underestimate the power of ignorance. Sins of others. That causes turmoil. People sin against us. Sin is occurring in various ways, and the sins of others, they certainly cause great turmoil. Our own sins ought to cause great turmoil. But then can turmoil have a good effect, a positive effect? When you look at the book of James, James says in James 1 and verse 2, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into" what? Various trials. Because these trials have an end, and it's stated in other places as well. There is a goal in mind, and that is to test and to prove and to bring about the increase of faith within you. So count it all joy. Sometimes the only way to reach the mountaintop is to go where? Through the valley. Through the valley of turmoil, the valley of trouble, the valley of trials, to get to the mountaintop. Oftentimes these are opportunities to show our faith and our faithfulness to God. In 2 Timothy 3:12, Paul says that we're not to be surprised if in this life we suffer persecutions for whom? Christ. The apostles in Acts chapter 5, they counted it a joy. They really looked at it as a joyous event that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. It's an opportunity to show one's faithfulness. And a lot of times, though it brings great turmoil and great pain and great hardship, the reality is our means of leaving this earth oftentimes is through trials and sickness and death. It is appointed unto a man once to die, and then what? Then comes the judgment, Hebrews 9:27. And Paul would go on to say in Romans 8, verse 18, that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the what? Glories or the joys that await us. What peace do we have in the midst of turmoil? What comfort do we find in the midst of trials? If we have the peace that passes understanding that Philippians 4 talks about, then we're identifying the peace that comes to us through the fact and the knowledge that we are God's children. And God is the source of peace. He's the God of all peace, according to Philippians chapter 4 and verse number 9. Therefore, He provides the peace that sustains us in this life. It helps us to better understand God. Helps us to better understand God. His strength versus our weakness. And that's what Paul learned by that thorn in the flesh. You remember? Paul said, "When I am weak, then I'm strong." Paul needed that thorn. He besought God 3 times to remove it. And God told him all 3 times what? No. 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 And Paul then said, Therefore I will glory in my weakness. Peace in the midst of turmoil helps us to better understand our love for others. And it ought to help develop that. How many of you have gone on a hospital visit? Or perhaps you've gone to a home where great suffering is taking place, and you go in, and because of the faithfulness and the love of those ones you're visiting, you go out of the room or you leave the home, and how are you feeling oftentimes? Better. You've gone to comfort, and in return you've been what? Comforted. Helps us to understand the love of God and love for others better. And then the third thing before we close on this one particular idea here. we better understand proper values. Any of y'all remember hearing stories about the Titanic, the ocean liner that sank, and how men and women, they were doing all they could to preserve themselves and to, just stay alive? Yet the story is told of individuals in that classification of that ship. You had the rich and the powerful, and then it went on down to those who had nothing. But the rich and powerful were going into their staterooms, and they were passing by their jewels and their furs. And they were going over and they were taking fruit and putting it in their pockets. Because in that moment, what had become valuable? Your gold necklace means nothing if you're at the bottom of the ocean. Food, oranges, apples, bananas, grapes, those things that they would have probably normally not even paid any attention to suddenly had what? Value. And when we're dealing with and have peace in the midst of trouble, it helps to what? Change our values, and really to right our values. And in that regard, what truly matters? What brings us peace in this life, even in the midst of trials, of turmoil? Knowledge of this fact: this world is not my home. It's not my home. And that helps to bring peace in the midst of turmoil. And it ought to help us as we come to deal with people. It ought to help us when we come to deal even with ourselves. But certainly it ought to give us great peace in this turbulent world in which we live. This world is not our home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. Thank you this morning.